Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where I talk about Middlemarch by George Eliot. Just in case you missed the memo, or maybe you are watching this video later on in time, I am currently doing a read-along of Middlemarch called Middlemarch Along, and it runs throughout the month of July in 2020, just in case you're watching like 2021. The first video I did on Middlemarch was about history. The novel is a historical novel, reform and unfulfilled optimism. When I made that video I was about 14 chapters in, and I'm now basically like halfway through. I love how I have no bookmark. My bookmark is currently my pencil. I've kind of pinpointed some things in this kind of up to book 5 where I am at the moment that have continued to stand out to me, and they are energy, emotion and the concept of work. Obviously all the things that I want to discuss, I'm very aware they all link into the conversations I had before about in terms of unfulfilled potential or optimism with Castleborn's work, or the Reform Acts again comes into the discussion of these themes in this video, and in the same way that a lot of my conversation here relates to marriage, and therefore when I finally do a marriage video, if I ever do a marriage video, that will also form that part of that conversation. There's also a specific discussion of place and private spaces that I would like to discuss in this video, because that is the thing I think, a bit like last week, the thing that stood out to me most was the Reform Acts, and this time it was Dorothea's boudoir. One thing I'm really fascinated with George Eliot, and in my mind whenever I read, I kind of imagine the prospective essays that I would write at university, and I keep going back to the relationship or any connection with George Eliot and Mary Wollstonecraft. In the first video I made, I talked about the lapdog and sensibility and femininity very briefly, about the fact that the inaction, I guess, of this lapdog, Dorothea saw as the worst kind of femininity, and she didn't really want to be associated with it. And for me that went straight back to Mary Wollstonecraft's similar like writing and discussion. And as I've been reading, obviously the concept of work or vocation is central to this novel for pretty much all of the characters. But every time I was reading, especially talking about kind of the vocation of Dorothea at the very beginning of her novel and how that changes over time, made me go straight back to Wollstonecraft and her concept of women needing a vocation as well as education, and therefore to be able to stand next to men as an intellectual equal, and kind of how vocation actually helps women. In the same way that Wollstonecraft talks about women's work in a society that is dominated by patriarchal structures. From the very prelude with St. Teresa, we know that Dorothea exists in an imperfect social state. We know that her ambitions have been made narrow or narrower. We know that she isn't going to be able to achieve what she wants to achieve because she is a woman. The novel is completely dominated by work and vocation, from Castleborn's key to mythologies, from Dorothea kind of drawing her cottage maps all the time, all of her designs, to Lydgate's new hospital. In the same way as the Reform Acts, which of course is Mr. Brooke's work and is Will's work, we know that their energy is going to be misplaced, or their work isn't going to have the movement or the desired effect they want it to. I mean, obviously we see this with Castleborn and the key to mythologies, which from very early on we realise is just outdated and there's no point in it. We also know that even when Dorothea has been away and hasn't been involved in the lives of kind of the cottagers and the villagers, we know that it still continues. She doesn't seem to have that action to actually exert change in the way that she wanted to. When Dorothea talks about marriage and she talks about her life, she makes it clear when she's talking to Will that it is about working for others, kind of working with her husband to actually make his like light burn brighter kind of thing. And that vocation is also central to the idea of marriage in the novel. In a lot of ways in the novel, Dorothea's work, and that of Rosamund's too, is that of their husbands. The limits that Eliot shows us from the very beginning with the imperfect social state shows that marriage is going to be the thing that limits them, but it's also a main part of vocation for women, but is limited within a patriarchal structure. That whole theme is completely summed up when, as I've already said, key to mythologies just doesn't work. It doesn't mean anything. Therefore, if vocation of women is associated with the work of their husbands, what does it mean when their husband's work is a complete failure? What does that say about a woman's place in society and her sense of self. The amount of failure that is in this novel is amazing, and it's probably one of my favourite things about the novel, even with, as I mentioned in the last video, with the view of optimism being unfulfilled and the failures of optimism, in the same way that work is a complete failure, and it kind of goes against, I guess, that Protestant work ethic which you can read in so much kind of Victorian writing. George Eliot is showing the social state to be completely imperfect. What happens when everything that society is based off, what happens when that fails, and where does that leave us? Just like the marriage plot, George Eliot just turns everything, society, the conventions, upside down, and that's why I love Middlemarch. And one of the key things at the moment when I'm reading is Dorothea is having conversations, or she's kind of distressed by the thought of having to continue Castleborn's work. The work at the beginning of the novel that she was excited to learn Latin and Greek for, the work she thought would be a real part of her being a wife. She doesn't want to continue the work because it's proven to be completely useless. It's impossible to talk about vocation and work without talking about the energy that is put into those things. When the work is failing in the novel, so do the characters and so do their energies. At the beginning of the novel, Dorothea almost lends energy to Castleborn, or he has more energy because of his intellect. She views his conversation as being more energized, I guess, because she views that his work has meaning. Then as we go along in the novel and Dorothea progresses, but we notice that, like, Castleborn's work doesn't, the energy that maybe she gave him at the dinner table or gave to his intellect dims and Castleborn crumbles. Like most central heroines, Dorothea has a lot of energy. It's one of her key characteristics from the very beginning of the novel. She's described as being animated or having an inward fire, a passion for something, a passion for her vocation. One of my favourite descriptors, I guess, of Dorothea comes at the beginning of the novel. I know this is supposed to be like about the midsection of the novel, but it's all coming together for me. So we're going back to the beginning when Dorothea is at conversation, is at dinner with Mr. Brooke, and Mr. Brooke says that Dorothea is more animated than a young lady like normally is or should be. Dorothea's energy and her animation separates herself in a lot of ways. She presents herself as being separate from that of Celia, going back to the lapdog imagery, and is often set in contrast with Rosamund. Mr. Brooke's critique of Dorothea and her energy links back to the fact, well, in fact, any critique that Mr. Brooke offers in this entire novel of women, one is, I think, very funny and one of my favourite things about the book, but also brings into question when energies are misplaced or deemed as being misplaced in patriarchy. And the kind of overly emotional woman, maybe more kind of attached to her hormones, is obviously a trope that has continued into society today, but is obviously very often in Victorian literature, and again links back to that kind of idea of sensibility with Wollstonecraft. Obviously in the conversation with Mr. Brooke, it is misplaced around wanting education. She wants that vocation, and the fact that Mr. Brooke is kind of viewing that as being misplaced because that's not where a woman's energy should go. It should go on being a perfect, quiet, submissive wife. Dorothea's arguments with Castleborn has been one of my favourite things to read in the novel. These different characters coming together and having these like little explosions. It's actually called like explosion in the novel, of having these kind of like pent up arguments where it's just seething resentment underneath. I'm quite an argumentative person, so I personally love seeing an argument in a novel, especially a Victorian novel where a woman goes against her husband. Love to see it. But in the context of these arguments, Dorothea is said to be excited in the same way that we would talk about like a little child being overexcited. The stereotype of women not being able to control their emotions, it's described in the novel as excessive feeling, obviously going back to sensibility. But I find it interesting when Dorothea's energy previously maybe made her spirited and, you know, wanted to work and wanted those vocation, when she's technically achieved what the imperfect social state wants her to be, which is to be a wife. It's interesting what happens to that energy when it becomes excessive feeling when she's a wife and when she's dissatisfied with her work of being a wife. I feel like this is when you can see kind of Middlemarch as a Bildungsroman, when you see Dorothea kind of going from her energy being spirited and a part of her kind of being a heroine, when it turns as a wife into excessive feeling, when that energy now is misplaced because society has failed her, or the limits that society has put on has changed that energy. As I said previously, Middlemarch for me challenges a lot of stuff that I consider Victorian literature to be, and approaches stuff really differently, and in a lot of ways I find Eliot a really fresh or like original writer because of that. And one of the ways is looking at emotion in this novel, and the fact that Dorothea cries, and she cries a lot. She sobs, and she sobs because she is a wife and the resentment that is building against Castleborn. The beginning of chapter 20 is when Dorothea cries for the first time, and there is so much in the first kind of couple of paragraphs of chapter 20 that you can just see the whole novel is changing from this point. A lot of change happens in Rome, with where Dorothea sees herself, the fact that she feels disillusioned in Rome and confused in Rome. It charts that beginning of progress for her character. Dorothea is also crying in her boudoir, which again I'm going to talk about a bit later, but the fact that she is in a boudoir, which the word comes from like sulking, she's in this private room. What I find interesting is that she is allowing herself to feel because she feels securely alone. The separation between the public place, this private space, one that she has carved out for herself, and feeling alone. But it's also interesting because that narrator, who I find fascinating and who I loved reading, especially at the beginning of this novel, the narrator is witnessing this. You have this weird, almost theatrical element to our self-consciousness, to the representation that the characters have of themselves. The narrator is reporting to us, I'm sorry to add that she was sobbing bitterly with such an abandonment. The reason Dorothea is allowing herself to cry is because she feels securely alone. It's the idea that the different self that we kind of, I guess, show to others, it's a really self-conscious moment of the realization that the way we present our sympathies and the way we present our emotions and energies are viewed as the way we think others view us. If that makes any sense, the self-consciousness. Middlemarch has been one of those novels that I've been very aware of when I think the narrator is wanting us to be sympathetic with certain characters, and when it happens more with some than with others. For example, in this scene we are supposed to almost see Dorothea as tragic. We're supposed to feel sympathy. The fact that we've been let into her boudoir at her most vulnerable moment, and also the fact that she's kind of confused, we are meant to feel sympathetic, and we do. But from what I'm reading of the novel, we aren't meant to feel the same way with Rosamund. The self-consciousness, I think, of the characters and their representation, I think, is key, with the fact that Dorothea is very different to Rosamund in the way that Rosamund's sense of self has come from those stereotypes of femininity. Do we sympathise less with Rosamund's set of circumstances because she seems to be more ingrained in the imperfect social state than Dorothea? What is interesting about how we view the different marriages, the different situations in terms of energy and emotion and sympathy is the fact that even though Dorothea wants a vocation and she wants to work, Rosamund also is described as being industrious. What is different though is when there seems to be a vocation rather than just enjoying doing things. The way that Rosamund is industrious is the fact that she is musical, or that she reads novels, or that she's involved in kind of feminine subjects. She enjoys doing the things that society has deemed good enough for a woman. The difference with Dorothea is that she's interested in the subjects of men. Therefore, do we see her as different or more worthy of sympathy because she's doing something outside the societal norms? That is a question I'll probably come into in another video. But for now, back to Dorothea and her crying. At this part of the novel, crying itself becomes a different kind of energy, and it also kind of notes the shift in the different types of energies away from the work that she thought she would be doing to the duties of a wife. What she thought she would be learning from Castleborn has changed, and her perception of her husband and her perception of what marriage is has changed. And the boudoir, I think, is key in this whole understanding of Dorothea's change and her emotion. When I first wanted to read Middlemarch, I was very much focused in terms of landscape in the kind of outer settings. Almost, I was concerned with Middlemarch's separation as a provincial town and its separation from a city. I was kind of thinking about it, I guess, more thematically that way than paying attention to the rooms which the characters inhabit. But now Dorothea's boudoir means everything to me. We know that Dorothea is moving in terms of society. She's also growing up. We start with her as a girl, as a not yet engaged. We see her as an engaged young woman. We see her as a new bride and as a, wife. Before Dorothea gets married, she sees Lowick where she will live as a wife, and she sees her boudoir, she sees her rooms, and the perception changes over time. The way Dorothea sees material items is very different, especially at the beginning of the novel, before she's a wife or when she's a very new wife. The descriptions of just the surroundings of the environment is a little bit more stripped back, because she wants those higher things. She wants the education rather than the materialism which she associates with Celia. The boudoir in Rome is where she has her most personal moments, and in fact the boudoir in general in this novel is where she has those private moments where she feels suffering most. It is the place in the novel where Dorothea is allowed to be herself, and that brings up the concept of self, of the energies that we present to the world, and how self-conscious we are of them, and the theatre of it almost. Dorothea is a very different person outwardly in the way that we all are, and when we're in our boudoir, in our private moments, we're viewing life and ourselves differently. But what's so interesting to me is that another description of her boudoir is where she isn't doing anything. And as I said before, Dorothea as a character has been defined by her animation, by her energy from the very beginning. But there is this really beautiful moment, I think, in the novel where Dorothea is looking out and she's just looking around, and she's youthful and, she's kind of blooming, but she's doing nothing. She's just watching. And I think it might be one of the first times in the novel where Dorothea isn't doing anything. When she's not designing cottages and she's not constantly thinking, it's a really intimate moment which I don't think Eliot has really let us into. Obviously we've had moments with Lydgate and Rosamund which are quite sexy, but this really private kind of moment of introspection happens in a boudoir, and I think is the moment where we also see Dorothea change most in terms of where she gives her energy and how she views herself. This is in chapter 28. It's actually earlier in the novel than I thought, but it's when she comes back, she goes into her boudoir, her first time in her house as Mrs. Castleborn. This is a part in the novel which I absolutely love, because it is a moment of silence, and it's when her energy doesn't come from conversation or doing things, it comes from just being. The fact that she's described as having a gem-like brightness, warm red life in her lips, she's glowing, she's so alive, but her energy is coming from herself and not from others, or not because of any work that she's perceiving. She's just allowed to live in this moment. It's also interesting that Eliot says the very furniture in the room seemed to have shrunk since she last saw it. Sorry, I'm annotating this as I go along. Again, it's that perception of change as she has moved and become a wife, and what she wants from a marriage has changed her perception of the room. Maybe her heightened ideals of what marriage could be, of the work she would be doing with Mr. Castleborn, how that's changed since they've been at Rome, and how maybe those ideals are also smaller. This is where George Eliot is an absolute genius. We have her at her most youthful. She's completely alive, but yet the room is smaller. She's sensing a dreary oppression. And in fact, listen to this. Her blooming, full-pulsed youth stood there in a moral imprisonment, which made itself one with chill, colourless, narrowed landscape with the shrunken furniture. The never-read books, because we know that Castleborn is useless, and the ghostly stag in a pale, fantastic world that seemed to be vanishing from the daylight. Everything she thought this room would contain, everything she thought her marriage would contain, has not worked out. Eliot is a flipping genius, I tell you that. The narrator, as always, knows more than us and marks those change earlier in a really famous passage. We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier for her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Castleborn and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom, than to conceive with that distinctness which is no longer reflection but feeling, an idea brought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent centre of self, whence the lights and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. There is so much, I have to say, that I really love about this novel, and the narrator is one. And we have these moments where, in fact, the things that you discover later on, you realise was perfectly summed up by the narrator earlier on in maybe a different chapter, but you were just on the same journey as Dorothea, and you realise that the narrator knew all of it all along. But in that passage, what is clear to me, if I link it back to the energy that I've kind of been discussing in this video, it's not necessarily that Dorothea's energies were misplaced, they were also just mismatched. They do not meet that of Mr. Castleborn, and therein lies the problem with all of the relationships within Middlemarch. I just realised I've now taken that pencil out because I was annotating, and I have no idea where I am now. So that will be fun for me to work out later. Where I am at the moment, which when I find my place again, is a point of change, where I think it will be a turning point for Dorothea's energies, for Lydgate's, for the marriages. I'm intrigued as to see where it will shift. I'm intrigued as to whether you feel that energy and work are so central to your reading of the novel. For me, it's now one of the key themes. I think when I started reading it, I was like, this is a novel of reform. And now I'm like, this is a novel about energy, misplaced energy, and mismatched energy. I'm intrigued to see when I read more what my next theme that I'm going to pick up on. And I do feel like I'm really charting Dorothea's progress, I think, more than obviously I thought at the beginning. I'm definitely seeing it as a bit more of kind of a buildings romance novel, so I'm intrigued. I am really enjoying it, but I think I'm enjoying it because I'm annotating it. I often tend to enjoy books more if I study them, and I feel like I get a bit more out of it. I'm also, I guess, coming up to, I think I'm probably over halfway now when I find where I am, because I've completely lost my place.